Today we're going to be talking about reorganization. And we're going to be doing this in two parts. This first part will be this morning. The second part will be this afternoon at 2 o'clock. And most of you know that in March 11th through 14th, we're going to be having a special reorganizational meeting. In fact, it's going to be here at Smyrna. And I believe that it's going to be a very important meeting. I think it's going to be a monumental meeting. I think it's going to be one of those meetings that heaven in its chronicles writes down as something very important and special that helped to finish the work, because that's what it's all about. Now today, I said we're going to be talking about this in two parts. The first part this morning is going to be a little bit on organization, the concept of organization. And then this afternoon, we're going to be looking at some church history that's, I think, important to lay a groundwork to help us to have the right frame of mind. And you know, the one who doesn't know history is doomed to repeat its mistakes of the past, we're told, something to that effect. And so we want to understand where things have went well before and where things haven't went so well before. And then next week, we'll go back and we'll get back onto our series that we've been working on as far as the fundamentals. But I wanted to do this today because I wanted to make this video for one thing. I want to send it out. We're going to be publishing an OPAS some more on this and give the people some alertness and time to prepare. Now, just about this time, 2 years ago, actually in November of 2019, I shared a message on gospel order. And we put it in video format. We published it in the January issue of OPAS, I believe it was. But this last issue of OPAS going out has sort of a truncated version of that study, a more condensed version of that study, because we felt like that there needed to be a refresher or a little updating maybe to it. And so the message I'm going to be sharing today is actually a truncated version of that. So it doesn't have to be so long, although we'll see how it actually works out. But I want to refresh our memories on some points that I think are vital to us, because I'm still getting questions from the field. I'm still getting calls and letters about this issue of reorganization. Is it really necessary? And other things that I think that we want to address. But gospel order, very simply, is God's plan for His people to work together in an orderly and harmonious manner. This can be done without having an hierarchy. It can be done without anarchy. It can be done without confusion or any kind of a dictatorial spirit that we see so often in Babylon. Now, in our Bibles, the Apostle Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 33, he made this statement: "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints." Paul recognized that the individual groups of believers in the different cities like Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamos and places that he would visit, maybe Laodicea, and he recognized that those people made up churches. They were churches. But he also recognized that all these churches were part of a larger church, or the body of Christ. And he says that God is not the author of confusion. Now, this word confusion in the Greek is an interesting word. It's akatathesia, and it means actually rebellion. And in fact, the Louw-Nida Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament, based on Semitic domains, says this: it means to rise up in open defiance of authority with the presumed intention to overthrow it, or to act in complete opposition to its demands, likely to carry the meaning of insurrection and revolts. So in one sense, yes, God doesn't want confusion. But he's speaking about order. He says God is not the author of confusion or rebellion, but rather of peace. And gospel order is designed to bring peace. It's designed to bring harmony. And when we work against that, we are working in rebellion against God. God says through the Apostle Paul also in 1 Corinthians 14 verse 40, "Let all things be done decently and in order." All things should be done decently and in order. And we have further been told by the servant of the Lord in volume 6 of the Testimonies and page 200 in paragraph 2 that order is heaven's first law. Think about that. And you know, if you are involved in any kind of a work project that involves multiple people, if you don't have order, if there's not some kind of an organization to it, what really happens? Nothing but chaos. Work isn't done efficiently if it's done at all. And so order is important. And God understands the necessity of having order. And we're told it is heaven's first law. And not only is it the first law, but there is perfect order. Not just order, but perfect order in heaven. For example, in Volume 4 of the Testimonies, on page 429 in paragraph 2, we are told that in heaven there is perfect order, perfect obedience, perfect peace, and harmony. Those who have had no respect for order or discipline in this life would have no respect for the order which is observed in heaven. They can never be admitted, they referring to the ones who would have disrespect for order and discipline. They can never be admitted into heaven, for all worthy of an entrance there will love order and respect discipline. I believe that. I really do. And I know that, for instance, as we in our lives, as we grow and as we learn, that having discipline is really important. My father was quite a disciplinarian, but he was a disciplined person. Now, I might not agree with everything he did, but he was disciplined about what he did. And my father had spent some time in both the Army and in the Air Force. And he had spent some time under Allie Stump, my grandfather, who probably was an extremely disciplined person. So my dad understood discipline. And he understood the need for discipline. Not just discipline in the sense of correction when someone does wrong, but in the sense of being orderly and keeping your life in a particular orderly fashion. Now, interestingly, in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 10 in the Lord's Prayer, Matthew chapter 10, verse 6, as we pray, we're to pray, Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done in earth, how? As it is in heaven. Now, how is God's will done in heaven? It's done in perfect order. If God's will in heaven is done in perfect order, and we are to pray for His will to be done in earth as it is in heaven, then we should be praying for perfect order here in this earth, shouldn't we? God's order, friends, above all, should be done in the church upon earth. Now, during the time of the wilderness wandering of the Israelites, God had an orderly camp, an orderly nation. He chose Moses to be the leader. Later, He chose Joshua. And there was order throughout Israel. Under Moses, he was given counsel by Jethro to allow others to help him, to have, if you please, subordinates. In Exodus chapter 18, verses 25 and 26, we read the following. And Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. And they judged the people at all seasons. The hard cases they brought unto Moses, but every small matter they judged themselves. This is telling us that Israel was, in many respects, we might say, a regulated nation. They had a regulated worship. None were allowed to feel as though they had a right to deviate from God's word or God's order in the slightest. If you think about the encampment of Israel, you had the sanctuary in the middle. But you had the tribes of Levi positioned nearest the sanctuary in a specific way. And then you had the 12 tribes, some on the north, some on the east, some on the west, and some on the south side, in a very specific order. Everything was done in an orderly way. Nothing was done haphazardly. God gave very specific directions about how worship would be done when the children of Israel got into Canaan. Through Moses, God instructed Israel concerning, for instance, the eating of sacrifices in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 8 and 9, the following. This is Deuteronomy 12, 8 and 9. He says, Ye shall not do after all the things that we do here this day, every man whatsoever is right in his own eyes, for ye are not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which the Lord your God giveth you. Another translation says it this way. Do not worship the way that you've been doing today, each person doing what he thinks is right. You have not yet come to a resting place, to the land the Lord your God will give you as your own. In other words, there was a time when people could sort of worship a certain way as they pleased, but as they came into as a nation, they became regulated. And he says, when you go in the land of promise, it stays this way, even more so. Now, in the New Testament, we find order. Jesus declared that he would establish a church, an assembly. In Matthew chapter 16, that famous chapter where Jesus speaks about, being the Son of God, and Peter says, "You are the Son of the living God." And verse 18, Jesus said, "And I will say unto thee, Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Now, some people, of course, said that he's speaking about Peter here. But the gates of hell prevailed against Peter on more than one occasion. He can't be speaking about Peter. He's speaking about the truth that Peter spoke about, the truth that Jesus is the Son of God. He says, I'm going to build a church based upon this fundamental truth. The church Jesus would build would be very similar in respect of order and administration to the Old Testament church. That there would be gospel order, that there would be a way to worship that would be acceptable and a way that wouldn't be acceptable. And God gave leadership to his church just like he gave leadership to the Old Testament Israelites. In Ephesians chapter 4, we read here about certain gifts that God would put in his church to help it to prosper and to be orderly. In Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 11 and 12 here, it says, "And he gave some apostles, and some prophets, and some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers." Why? "For the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ." And verse 13, "Till we all come into the unity of the faith and knowledge of the Son of God, unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ." Verse 14, "That we henceforth be no more children tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness whereby they lie in wait to deceive." Now, it should be clear as we read the context of Ephesians 4 that the he, the pronoun he that is spoken of in these verses is referring to Christ. We could say, "Wherefore Christ saith, when Christ ascended up on high, Christ led captivity captive and gave gifts unto men." The one who ascended up on high is Jesus, the same one who gives gifts to men, these gifts of pastoral work, evangelists, teachers, apostles, and prophets. And they are not, now listen to this carefully, they are not in the church because the church decided to institute these responsibilities. Did you get that? Pastors aren't in churches because the church decided that there should be a pastor. Apostles aren't in the church because the people decided there should be apostles. This was decided by Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ established this leadership and this order in the church. And I've heard people insist, go so far as to insist that, in this era, we don't need pastors. We're going to let Jesus be our pastor. Jesus will be our only pastor. But friends, if we take that kind of an attitude, and I can understand why some people might initially take that kind of an attitude, because the pastors that they've had have just run roughshod over the people. They've abused them. They thrust, as Ezekiel said, side and shoulder. They've not fed the flock. I can understand why people could be reluctant to want to have those kinds of pastors and why they would want a shepherd like Jesus. But friends, Jesus says he has put within his church pastors that will do the work. They are under shepherds that will feed the flock. He has put in leadership. He has designated those to be apostles who would be leaders in the church and so on. And so when we rebel against this order, friends, when we resist such order, we are actually in open defiance to the authority of Christ. This is what Paul was speaking about in 1 Corinthians 14:33. He said there's not to be this confusion, this rebellion among us as people. Now, certainly God does not wish for his body to be broken up into many factions, or we might say independent atoms. And this is what we have seen, though, so much, what I have seen personally so much in the last 35 years plus that I've been associated with this movement. I've seen this ministry over here, this group over there, this little preacher over here, and they're all doing their own little thing, working as independent atoms. Instead of working as molecules, if you please. You know what a molecule is, don't you? A molecule is a substance that's formed from a combination of atoms, right? God wants his church to be like a molecule, not just independent atoms, but all together. And we've been told in many places, and I'll just share a couple of them here. This is first is from the Spalding McGann collection on page 121, where we read this. An army in battle, and this is just good thoughts. Think about this. An army in battle would become confused and weakened unless all worked together in concert. If soldiers should act out their own impulsive ideas without reference to each other's positions and work, they would be a collection of independent atoms. They could not do the work of an organized body. So the soldiers of Christ must act in harmony. Continuing, they alone must not be cherished. If they do this, the Lord's people, in the place of being in perfect harmony, of one mind, one purpose, and consecrated to one grand object, will find efforts fruitless, their time and capabilities wasted. Union is strength. Union is strength. A few converted souls acting in harmony, acting for one grand purpose under one head, we know that head is Christ, will achieve victories at every encounter. Now think about that, friends. The early disciples, there was just 12 apostles, and one of them became an apostate. And then in that upper room, there was just how many? 120 souls. Not many people, but within a day, there were like thousands added unto the church, right? And we're coming together in March, and I dare say there might not even be 120 of us in March come together. I hope we can have that many. That'd be great. But friends, it doesn't matter if we are few or many. The Lord's arm is not short. His ear is not heavy that He cannot hear. He can help us. And we have this promise that a few converted souls acting in harmony, acting in this union, having this strength for this one grand purpose under the true head of Christ will achieve victories at every encounter. Also, in Letters and Manuscripts, Volume 8 and Letter 16 of 1893 in paragraph 20, very just simply it says, I know that the Lord loves His church. It is not to be disorganized or broken up into independent atoms. If it says it's not to be disorganized, that means it must be what? Organized. Organized. And, these are just some of other statements that should lay aside all doubt that we might have to the idea that we can please God and finish the work independently. It's not going to happen, friends. I've been watching this thing, and I've been involved in, as I said, for over 35 years. And in many respects, we're not a lot further ahead than we were 35 years ago. Yes, there are many more believers, but as far as coming into a way to finish this work, to share the three angels' messages, to give the final warning to the world, I'm not sure we're much closer, to be honest. And it's because haven't been much closer in having gospel order. But friends, that's going to change in March. By God's grace, that's going to change in March. In Acts of the Apostles, page 164, and paragraph 1, notice this. It says, the Lord, in His wisdom, has arranged that by means of the close relationship that should be maintained by all believers, Christian shall be united to Christian and church to church. Thus, the human instrumentality will be enabled to cooperate with the divine. Every agency will be subordinate to the Holy Spirit, and all the believers will be united in an organized and well-directed effort to give to the world the glad tidings of the grace of God. Now notice she speaks about believers being united with believers. And if you are in a little home church where you're at tonight or today or wherever it is, and you're there in unity and harmony, and that union gives strength, good. You're in the local church, you have those fellowship of believers to believers. We have that here. But that's not all. It says church should be united to church. The different churches should be united together. And when we do this, we can have a united, organized, and well-directed effort to give to the world the glad tidings. The glad tidings is just another phrase for what? Gospel. The gospel. So that we can give the gospel of God's grace. Now, organization, let's think about the term organization, because the term order doesn't really scare people too much, but the term organization might be a little scary. But you know how the dictionary defines organization? It says this, that organization is an organized group of people with a particular purpose. So just having an organization of itself doesn't mean that you've done wrong or that you've left the Lord's plan. It just means that you're a group of people, you're part of a movement who are organized. You have an organized way of sharing the work. God originated the church in the Old Testament, and then He originated the church in the New Testament. And today, friends, finally, when the three angels' messages began to be given, He organized the Advent people after the pattern of the New Testament church. And order and structure were given to the people, and I think it's order and instruction that we dare not disregard today. In Testimonies to Church Regarding Individual Responsibility and Christian Unity, page 19, paragraph 2, and this is written in 1907, we read this. Oh, how Satan would rejoice if he could succeed in his efforts to get in among this people and disorganize the work at a time when thorough organization is essential and will be the greatest power to keep out spurious uprisings and to refute claims not endorsed by the Word of God. So what does Satan want to do? He wants to disorganize, but God wants to organize. He wants order and organization in His work. It says, we want to hold the lines evenly, that there shall be no breaking down of the system of organization and order that has been built up, how? By wise and careful labor. License must not be given to disorderly elements that desire to control the work at this time. So friends, under the direction and the inspiration of God, workers such as Elder James White, Joseph Bates, Jan Andrews, carefully build up the work. And she says that that kind of work that they build up should not be allowed to have disorderly elements or to be broken apart. Now, the question that maybe we need to consider is, are we authorized to begin a new organization? And I think that this is an important point that needs to be clarified. I recently received a letter cautioning against this reorganization. And this was interestingly from someone who is a member of the Shepherd's Rod movement. Have you ever heard of the Shepherd's Rod? And they're a strange group. It's true, a fringe Seventh-day Adventist sort of movement. And they speak about the apostasy of the church and how bad the church is, but they say the church is still the church and you don't leave the church. And so this person was saying, you know, I agree with a lot of what you say about the truth and things, but you shouldn't reorganize because that means like you're leaving the church. How do we relate to that? If we have been counseled, for example, not to, quote, leave the church, and indeed we've been counseled by the Spirit of God that there is not to be a new organization, what do we mean when we talk about reorganization? I think that's important to know. Well, first I want to establish a point or two, and I think these are pretty much firm in our minds already, but just so that there's no confusion, in Selected Messages, Book 2, page 389.3, we are told that after the passing of time, God entrusted to His faithful followers the precious principles of present truth. Now here we have some subjects, a subject, a verb, direct object, maybe indirect objects. But it says the noun is God, and the verb is entrusted. And who did He entrust to? His servants. And what did He entrust to them? Precious principles of present truth. These were not things that these men just came up with on their own. These are truths that were heaven delivered to us. God gave His people principles, even precious principles of present truth. God did not raise up this movement in error, as Trinitarian Adventists claim today. You know that, don't you? That the leaders of the church today, they claim that this movement was raised up in error. They say that God allowed them to believe a hideous, apostate, heretical belief about Himself for over 50 years before He corrected it. Can you believe that? But that's not what this testimony says. Not at all. It's these principles, friends, these principles of truth that make us who we are as a people. In Selected Messages, also Book 2, the next paragraph, 389.4, those who pass through these experiences are to be firm as a rock to the principles that have made us Seventh-day Adventists. Now, notice that. What is it that has made us real Seventh-day Adventists? The principles of truth. What is it that makes a Baptist a Baptist? It's not that they have a big chicken dinner after church each week, right? It's what the doctrines, the things that they believe make them Baptists. What makes the Methodists Methodists? The things that they believe. What makes a Seventh-day Adventist? The things they believe. And a true Seventh-day Adventist, according to this, are the ones who believe those principles of truth that God gave to His people. Now, to leave these principles, think about this, to leave these principles, what would that mean? If I had been a Baptist and I quit believing the Baptist belief and start believing, for instance, Catholicism, am I really a Baptist anymore? No, I'm not a Baptist at all. I'm a Catholic now, right? And so it's the things that we believe that make us what we are. But if we leave these principles, it would disqualify us, friends, from being the remnant people. And Ellen White saw this, and she clearly warned us, saying this: "The Lord has declared that the history of the past shall be rehearsed as we enter upon the closing work." Every truth. How many of the truths? Every truth. Every truth that He has given for these last days is to be proclaimed to the world. Every pillar. How many pillars? Every pillar. Wisdom hath hewn out her 7 pillars. Every pillar that He hath established is to be strengthened. We cannot now step off the foundation that God has established. We cannot now enter into any new organization, for this would mean apostasy from the truth. Notice that last statement again. We cannot now enter into any new organization, for this would mean apostasy from the truth. And so, if we would just give a little summary here, we see that God entrusted to the Seventh-day Adventist Church precious principles of truth. These principles of truth make someone a Seventh-day Adventist. And finally, to step off the foundation of these principles, to apostatize from these truths, results in a new organization, a new church, and a forfeiting of being Seventh-day Adventists. You see, friends, when the professed church, and I say that carefully, when the professed church steps off the foundation which God established, if they discard the pillars instead of strengthening them, they have formed a new organization. And as I am so quick to make note of in Romans chapter 2 and verse 1, we so oftentimes condemn people of the very sins of which we ourselves are most guilty. Here we have an organizational structure today that looks at people like us, and they say, you're starting a new organization. You shouldn't do that. But they are the ones, by discarding the principles of truth, that have done this. And we can see this as you look at the fundamental principles that are believed today, openly, professedly believed by the structure, I'll call it the structure of the Seventh-day Adventists that are headquartered in Silver Springs, Maryland. You see there a total change in so many important fundamentals, and especially fundamentals that are pillars of the faith in Adventism. You see a restructuring of the doctrine of God. You see a restructuring of the doctrine of the sanctuary in Christ's heavenly ministry. You see a total absence of anything on the man of sin, the mark of the beast. That they've formed a new organization. And this point was forcibly brought forth by the former General Conference President Neil Wilson at a speech given at the annual council in Washington, D.C. in October of 1997. I know it's going back a few years, but friends, this thing's been going on for a while. Now, he was quoted in the Adventist Review, and he said this: "Our doctrines cannot be changed without changing the nature of the church." Well, that's what we've been saying all along, and that's exactly right. But what happened was, they did change the doctrine, so therefore they changed the nature of the church. And again, it's these things that make us who and what we are. It's what makes the Baptists who they are. It's what makes the Pentecostals what they are, or whoever you are. It's the things that you believe. And when Adventists who formerly believed and practiced those precious principles of present truth reject those principles for false principles, they have left Seventh-day Adventism, even if they claim to use the same name. The name doesn't mean anything. It's what you believe. It's how you live. You know, I went to a bar one time when I was younger and foolish and before I became a Christian. The name of the bar was Paradise. Didn't make it paradise, did it? Far from it. Far from it. So let's consider, for just a minute, those who believe and practice the precious principles of present truth. Perhaps they've been disfellowshipped from the larger body, who call themselves Seventh-day Adventists, but who have left the platform of truth. Now, are those ones who've been disfellowshipped, are they not really the true Seventh-day Adventists? Because they believe those precious principles of truth and they're living on that platform of truth? They surely are, friends. And if these people, now listen carefully, if these people reorganize the movement, they're not starting a new movement, they're not starting a new organization, they're simply continuing and putting gospel order back into what was originally given to those people, because they hold those precious principles of present truth. And for them to reorganize the original church with its original doctrines is not a violation of the instruction not to form a new organization, the very thing that the professed Seventh-day Adventist Church Corporation has done. Now, I read to you a statement from Neil Wilson from 1979 at the annual council. That was given before the 1980 General Conference that they had in Dallas, Texas, because he knew that they were planning to rewrite the fundamentals at that time. And he assured the people, we're not teaching anything new or different, we're just putting it in more modern, up-to-date language. But the fact is, those beliefs were changed, many of them. Many of them have been changed back in 1931, and they were changed further in 1980. But the interesting thing is that in 1980, you had for the first time the General Conference as a body approving a fundamental series of beliefs. And so it wasn't just simply the leadership that we can blame, but we have to blame the whole fundamental church at that time. And instead of the biblical teaching of God, the principles of the Athanasian Creed that formed the papacy from the Council of Nicaea were accepted concerning the doctrine of the Trinity. As Neil Wilson noted, and really it should be truly self-evident, if you change the doctrines, you change the nature of the church, especially doctrines that describe the God you worship. But friends, God was not taken by surprise. Through his prophetess, he alerted the remnant people that they could expect a coming apostasy and what to expect if this happened. And he gave to her this following thing. And this is in Selected Messages, Book 1, page 204, paragraph 2, and I've broken it into 3 slides for you. It says, the enemy of souls. Now, who is the enemy of souls? Satan. The enemy of souls has sought to bring in the supposition that a great reformation was to take place among Seventh-day Adventists, and that this reformation would consist in giving up what? The doctrines that stand as the pillars of our faith and engage in a process of what? Reorganization. Were this reformation to take place, what would result? Here's the result. The principles of truth that God in his wisdom has given to the remnant church would be what? Discarded. The principles of truth, especially those that deal with some of our pillars. What is the result of that? Our religion would be changed. The fundamental principles that have sustained the work for the last 50 years would be accounted as error. Fundamental principles like the truth about God. Fundamental principles about like the sanctuary and the ministry of Christ in heaven. These principles, it says, that they would be accounted as error. And what is the result now? A new organization would be established. They think they're only going to reorganize the work, but they create a new organization. A new organization would be established. Books of a new order would be written. Books that wouldn't teach the truth anymore. Books that would teach error. A system of intellectual philosophy would be introduced. The founders of this system would go into the cities and do a wonderful work, so they think at least. The Sabbath, of course, would be lightly regarded as also the God who created it. Nothing would be allowed to stand in the way of the new movement. In other words, friends, it's going through. It's not going to get changed. Don't think for a minute that if you get enough Walter Weiss, Doug Batchelors, and Stephen Boers, and whoever else you want to put in there, and get them together and really do a ground roots movement, that this thing's going to change, because it's not. It's not going to change, and I say that, and I know that based upon what inspiration has told us here. Nothing would be allowed to stand in the way of the new movement. The leaders would teach that virtue is better than vice. Well, they teach some good things, I guess. But God being removed. Did you see that? God being removed. They would place their dependence on human power, which without God is worthless. Their foundation would be built on the sand, and storm and tempest would sweep away the structure. Friends, Satan will try to bring this in among us if we'll let him. He's brought it in among the big church. And this false reformation would consist in giving up the doctrines which stand as the pillars of our faith. And this would result in the process of reorganization, later said to be a new organization. Now remember, we as Seventh-day Adventists were given principles of precious truth, but this false revival would discard those principles of truth, leading to the change in religion, or in fact a new organization. And then Ellen White lists what would be the results if this revival were accepted. And notice clearly, the first thing she stated was that our religion would be changed. It would be changed. Not only are the principles given up, but they would be accounted as error. As error. And if you go to any Adventist pastor today, you go to any Adventist administrator. I've talked to Ted Wilson personally in Russia one time about this, and you ask them about the truth about God, they will tell you that that is heresy. It's accounted as error. Just this week I was talking with Brother John Christophe, and he says, "You will not believe what they're teaching in France now." I said, "Well, I probably would actually, but tell me." He says, there is a professor, former professor from the school at Cologne, where they have the big Adventist seminary there, and he's been like a conference administrator and maybe a president or something of the conference. He's out preaching. He gave me several links. Of course, I can't read French. I can't listen to the French very well. But he says, this man is now teaching that there is no sanctuary in heaven. He's just teaching there's no sanctuary in heaven. Can you imagine that? Ellen White does not say that God leads his people because of these issues, but instead, God being removed. They remove God. They push God out. God is set aside by the leaders of this movement. God is, if you pleased, disfellowshipped from the denomination. And the final end of the prophecy, that storm and tempest would sweep away the structure, has yet to been fully realized. But friends, it's only a part of this prophecy, and it, just like the rest of it that's been fulfilled, it will surely be fulfilled in its time. This inspired statement tells us, friends, that if we step off the foundation of the principles given to us in the beginning, we apostatize from the truth and we begin a new organization. We have noted earlier that the corporate Seventh-day Adventist Church has indeed apostatized from its fundamental principles concerning God. Thus, it is a different church, a new organization from that which existed when the pioneers were living. This has further been emphasized by a statement that was made by a former Andrews University professor, George Knight, a famous writer, probably well known to some of you. But in the Ministry magazine in October 1993 on page 10, he stated, and this is true, exactly true what he states, most of the founders of Seventh-day Adventism would not be able to join the church today if they had to subscribe to the denomination's fundamental beliefs. More specifically, most would not be able to agree to belief number 2, which deals with the doctrine of the Trinity. Friends, nothing will be allowed to stand in the way of the new movement. You're not going to change it. Don't think that if you bark loud enough, squawk hard enough, that anything's going to change. It's not going to change. It's only getting deeper. Now, we need to understand then how we relate to this. What does the Bible say? Well, the Bible gives us some principles about how we relate to error and apostasy. In Amos chapter 3, by the way, I was reading the book of Amos this week. There's so many really, really good verses in Amos. I would encourage you, if you haven't read Amos for a while, to read Amos. He says, he asks a question actually, but the answer is implied. Can two walk together except they be agreed? No, you can't. You can't. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verses 16 and 17, he says, "In what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will," what? "Receive you." Revelation chapter 18 and verse 4. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and receive not of her plagues. So friends, beloved, we have a responsibility, don't we? If we're going to obey the Word of God, we have to come out from that which has apostatized. We can't stay in it. Now, God has called for reorganization in the past. At times, when wrong principles were being adopted, God called, through His servant Ellen White, for a reorganization. And this afternoon, in the next part of this session, I want to talk about some of the history of the order and organization, reorganization of the work. But during the 1901 General Conference session, Ellen White made this statement. You find this in the bulletin for April 3, 1901, paragraph 5. And this is actually a statement she made while she was on the platform of the General Conference, and the leadership of the General Conference was sitting behind her at this time. So think about that when you hear the statement. That these men, referring to those leaders, should stand in a sacred place to be as a voice of God to the people, as we once believed the General Conference to be. That is past. What we want now is a reorganization. She didn't say a new organization, a reorganization of that movement that was already begun. We want to begin at the foundation to build upon a different principle. That was 1901. And this afternoon we're going to be talking about what that principle, that specific principle she's talking about is. But sadly, the corporate Seventh-day Adventist Church has apostatized from the principles concerning God, which they held for the first 50 years, the truths about the sanctuary they held for the first 50 years, and they formed a new organization, a new church. And Ellen White counsels us that when the church departs from those principles, the appropriate response is to reorganize and return to those first fundamental principles. Therefore, beloved, I believe it is time for those who believe and practice those precious principles of truth to take action. This action is not to create a new organization, but to reorganize the movement God has raised up in 1844 and to move forward with the work of the remnant people. Because, friends, we have truth. And we have a truth that admits of no compromise. And we should believe and cherish that truth and teach that truth. Because we have been assured that it is as certain that we have the truth as that God lives. This is in Volume 4 of the Testimonies, page 595 and paragraph 4. And this is written in 1881, by the way. 1881. Not in 1997 or 1998 or the turn of the century, 1881. It is as certain that we have the truth as that God lives, and Satan with all of his arts and hellish power cannot change the truth of God into a lie. While the great adversary will try his utmost to make of none effect the word of God, truth must go forth as a lamp that burneth. Friends, it is still as certain that God gave His people this truth, and Satan cannot turn the truth of God into a lie, even if 20+ million people claim to believe that lie. I understand that right now there's about 27, give or take a few million probably, Seventh-day Adventists. Depending on whose list you look at, they're anywhere from, I think, the 5th to the 7th largest denomination, Protestant denomination in the world. A lot of people there. I don't care if there's 127 million. I don't care if there's 127 billion of them. That doesn't make it truth, friends. There's over 1 billion Muslims in this world. Doesn't make it truth. But we need to stand true to the principles that God has given us, and we need to finish this work, and we're not going to finish it. I promise you, we're not going to finish it without having more gospel order. We need to have organization. And this afternoon, in our next session, we're going to be talking about some history that will show us some things that will help us to avoid some pitfalls, and maybe to find some things that will be helpful to us as we do that. I do want to encourage each one of you to participate and to be a part of the reorganizational effort that, as we have been studying, we've seen really is essential. It's not forming a new organization. We're simply reordering the work from what disastrous results have occurred due to the apostasy of the leadership. And I believe that if we can work together on this, we can help bring the true gospel order needed back into the church so that we can finish the work and we can all go home. In ancient times, Israel, at many different times or parts of sections of the Bible you find, they reviewed history. In the time of Nehemiah, just before Moses died, really the book of Deuteronomy is more of a historical recollection of the things that happened before and so on. And so these histories would review the leading of God among His people, and they would be read or rehearsed to the people. Sometimes this would take many hours, and sometimes, in fact, even days were involved in these kind of things. But today I wanted to continue this by rehearsing some of the history of the Advent people and our organization and how it relates to us today. And I think of this statement from Life Sketches on page 196 in paragraph 2 that we have up right now. It says, "In viewing our past history, having traveled over every step of advance to our present standing, I can say, praise God. As I see what the Lord hath wrought, I am filled with astonishment and with confidence in Christ as our leader. We have nothing to fear for the future except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and His teaching in our past history." So, two great things to remember: the way the Lord has led us and His teaching. And we have nothing to fear for the future if we can remember those things, but of course, remembering them also implies implementing the things that are right. Now, before that history that we're going to be talking about, just a little bit more on some current events. Again, as many of you know, during the last 2 years, many within the One True God movement, or OTG, or the Truth About God movement, whatever you wish to call it, but many of us have been discussing gospel order and the need to reorganize the work. And this work was just starting to begin when COVID-19 was erupting. And COVID-19 put a wrench into the plans of many things, including the work of reorganization. But you know, there's a promise that I trust that we find in the book Desire of Ages on page 32 and paragraph 1. And it says, "Like the stars in the vast circuit of their appointed path, God's purposes know no haste and no delay." I like that, don't you? Sometimes we think things have to be done within a certain time, or that they have a longer time stretch that they can go into. But she says that His purposes know no haste and no delay. Now, this work of reorganization has actually been begun in other parts of the country. In the Philippines, Pastor David Sims has helped to transform the gospel work there into better order. And they are actually now have several churches working together. They have a unified paper. They have projects they're working on together. They're trying to establish a printing press right now. A lot of good things are happening that couldn't have happened otherwise because of organization and order. In the nation of France, Brother Jean-Christophe Ballot, Pastor Ballot, has been working there to help bring people in the gospel order. And you know, honestly, I guess us as Americans, we don't like being last at anything. So we have to come in and get going here to keep up with these other people. But I want to tell you, it's encouraging to me that in the last 5 months here in the United States, we have seen some progress. After the 2021 camp meeting that was held at Smyrna, a meeting of interested parties took place, and we began to look at a sample charter and a set of bylaws, or something like having a church constitution would look like. And we began molding this after what had already been done in the Philippines and in France. They were examined first because we believe that the Lord was leading those people too. And we just thought, you know, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We maybe need a different little type of tread on our wheel here in America for some unique situations we have in America compared to other places, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And so we've been working on these things for the last 5 months or so. And in the February issue of OPAS, which some of you may have already received, but you will be receiving soon if you're on that mailing list, there is a copy of the charter and the bylaws there for you to look at. Now, I want to just say that these documents, and please understand this, these documents are not necessarily in their final form. They're documents to be reviewed by those who wish to participate in the reorganizational effort that's going to happen in March. So nothing is set in stone, nothing's already been done, and people are told they either have to like it or lump it or come into it or not. This is just something that we can start on. It's a basis, we believe it's a very good basis to start on. And it may in fact be good enough to be the final basis for starting and this reorganization of the church. but I hope that you will read those carefully and understand that there was a lot of prayer and a lot of effort put into trying to make them as good as they are now. In the 1840s, a movement was in force. The believers of the message of Daniel 8:14 began to coalesce, and even after October 22 of 1844, there were believers that believed that they had to keep going, that there was more, and they began to work together and draw together. By 1861, the Michigan Conference of the Seventh-day Adventists was formed. They established a publishing house at this time. As other fields began to organize, they came together to form a general conference. Those several meetings that were held in local areas, sometimes would be called a general conference per se. They were simply meeting but not forming an organization. On May the 21st of 1863, the brethren met in Battle Creek to begin forming the organization that we would know as the General Conference. It's of interest to note that Uriah Smith wrote a short report about the unity and the atmosphere of the conference. And I just want to quote a portion of what he wrote. And he says, "We can say to the readers of the review, think of everything good that has been written of every previous meeting and apply it to this. All this would be true, and more than this, perhaps no previous meeting that we have ever enjoyed was characterized by such unity of feeling and harmony in sentiment. In all the important steps taken at this conference in the organization of a general conference and the further perfecting of the state conference," and he goes on, "defining the authority of each and the important duties belonging to their various officers, there was not a dissenting voice. And we may reasonably doubt if there was even a dissenting thought. Such union on such points affords the strongest grounds of hope for the immediate advancements of the cause and its future glorious prosperity and triumph." And then he goes on to say, "The influence of this meeting cannot fail to be good. We are certain that those who were present, as they will look back upon the occasion, will not be able to discover an unpleasant feature. And as they separated to go to their homes, courage and good cheer seemed to be the unanimous feelings." What Brother Smith was reporting on here was a feeling of strong unity, love, unanimity among the group, that there was not any dissenting discord, that they were in agreement with what they were doing. God was certainly blessing those people as they came together to create an organization that could work in a unified way to carry the message forward. Now, things didn't always go uphill from there. We've all heard about the 1888 Minneapolis Conference and some of the divisive issues and issues that came out of that. But then there came the general conferences in 1893 and 1895, where A.T. Jones was given a very predominant speaking position at those conferences, and he spoke eloquently about the third angel's message and the work that God has given for us. Ellen White also began calling for reform and reorganizing in the work. This call for reorganization began even as far back as 1897 and before that. In fact, in 1897, the General Conference did something that you probably have never heard of. They elected 3 General Conference presidents because they separated the field into 3 different main groups. There was a General Conference of America, a General Conference of Europe, and General Conference of Australia, because of all the work that had been going on in Australia. And from within those 3 General Conferences, they were to subdivide the rest of the field or the world and work their respective areas. And so there were actually 3 General Conferences and 3 General Conference presidents during that time, although you probably won't see the history to that effect very well. In 1901, a new constitution was introduced to the world field that included no president at all. It recommended a committee of 25 men to help run the General Conference. And the idea originally was that there would be a rotating chairman who would help chair the conference It eventually came down to a permanent chairman of one person who happened to be A.G. Daniels, but he was not elected president of the General Conference. Now, in relationship to that conference and this change made, Ellen White could write the following. She says, this is in the Bulletin of April 25, 1901, Article A, paragraph 24. Who do you suppose has been among us since this conference began? Who has kept away the objectionable features that generally appear in such a meeting? Who has walked up and down the aisles of this tabernacle? Now remember, this was held in Battle Creek. It was one of the last, in fact, it was the last General Conference that they had at Battle Creek. It says, the God of heaven and his angels, and they did not come here to tear you in pieces, but to give you right and peaceable minds. They have been among us to work the works of God, to keep back the powers of darkness, that the work God designed should be done should not be hindered. The angels of God have been working among us. She says that at that General Conference, the angels of God were working. She went on to say in the next paragraph of that same article, if any people have reason to praise God, we have. Angels of God have been at work here. The Lord knew our needs and sent us food which has given spiritual strength and light, showing us how we should work. We have been trying to organize the work on right lines. Now notice she's speaking about organization. We've been trying to organize the work on right lines. The Lord has sent his angels to minister unto us, who are heirs of salvation, telling us how to carry the work forward. So how was the work to be carried forward? Now, there were some good things that happened at that General Conference, but a total work wasn't done. A total work wasn't done. Because of the lack of a total work being done, seeds were sown that allowed events to transpire 2 years later in the 1903 General Conference that would change things. On January the 5th of 1903, Ellen White wrote the following, and I'm going to share with you a statement. Now, she doesn't specifically state when this experience took place, but we know it was before January 5 because that's when she wrote it. But she's relating about something that the Lord had revealed to her. And here it is. One day at noon, I was writing of the work that might have been done at the last General Conference, and she's referring to 1901. That had been the last one. If, excuse me, if the men in position of trust had followed the will and way of God, those who have had great light have not walked in the light. The meeting was closed, and the break was not made. Men did not humble themselves before the Lord as they should have done, and the Holy Spirit was not imparted. Now here was a meeting. She said angels of God were, the very God of heaven had come down and walked up and down the aisles of that meeting. And she said we could rejoice because of this. But later, as she saw things develop and as the Lord revealed to her, a thorough work had not been done. And so certain issues had to be dealt with. And she says, I'd written thus far when I lost consciousness. And I seemed to be witnessing a scene in Battle Creek. Well, what was that? Here she tells about it. We were assembled in the auditorium of the tabernacle. Prayer was offered. A hymn was sung, and prayer was again offered. Most earnest supplication was made to God. The meeting was marked by the presence of the Holy Spirit. The work went deep, and some present were weeping aloud. Continuing. No one seemed to be too proud to make heartfelt confession, and those who led in this work were the ones who had influence, but had not before had courage to confess their sins. She continues, there was rejoicing, such as never before had been heard in the tabernacle. You may be thinking, well, when did I read about this in history? Well, you didn't, because again, this was something God showed her. And notice what else it says. Then I aroused from my unconsciousness, and for a while could not think where I was. My pen was still in my hand. The words were spoken to me. This might have been. All this the Lord was waiting to do for his people. All heaven was waiting to be gracious. I thought of where we might have been had thorough work been done at the last General Conference. And so these glorious things she saw, the brethren confessing their sins and weeping before each other and showing true brotherly love and coming together in the way they should, she said this might have been, but it wasn't. It wasn't as it should have been. And because the thorough work had not been done, we find that in 1903, a new constitution was brought back to the General Conference. Now, Ellen White had been talking about reforming the work, reforming the way the work should be done, and the idea that we shouldn't have a single man at the head of the work. And so in 1897, they broke it up into three. In 1900, they abolished a presidency altogether. But in 1903, a new constitution was brought before the people for the church to follow. And this included the office of president. It was introduced again. And provision was made for a 25-member committee general conference, of which a quorum could be called of just 5 members plus the president. Think about that. You have a committee of 25 men, but if you just get 5 of them together and the president's there, you can conduct a meeting with only 1/5 of the men of the committee. Interestingly, after the Constitution was brought to the floor and read, a minority report, or after the Constitution was brought to the floor and they had some minor discussion on it, they allowed a minority report to come to the field. So you had this group of people on this Constitution and Bylaws Committee, and there was like about 11 people or maybe a few more on it, but somewhere around 11 to 13 people on it. And you can find the list of the names, by the way, in the bulletins. But they brought out a minority report because there were 3 people of all the group who objected to this Constitution. And they actually prepared what they called a minority report. The only time, to my knowledge, in the General Conference anything like this ever had been done or ever has been done since. And I want to read to you the minority report because it's relatively short. It just has 3 paragraphs. But here's what the minority report read about the General Conference. And you can find this in the General Conference Bulletin of April 10 of 1863, also page 146, paragraph 22. It says, "The minority of your Committee on Plans and Constitution beg leave to submit that the Constitution proposed by the majority of the Committee appears to us to be so subversive of the principles of organization given to us at the General Conferences of 1897 and 1901 that we cannot possibly subscribe to it." Now, let's just review. In 1897, 1901, were there principles of organization that had been altered and changed toward the better? Yes. They broke up the presidency into 3 parts, and then they finally removed the presidency. And they said, this new Constitution is subversive to those principles that God gave us. They continued, "The proposed new Constitution reverses the reformatory steps." They understood they were reformatory steps that were taken, and the principles which were given and adopted as the principles of reorganization in the General Conferences of 1897 and 1901, and embodied in the present Constitution, and this before that Constitution, or the organization according to it, has ever had adequate trial. They said, we've only had this for 2 years. It's not enough time. And then they concluded, "We therefore recommend that the Constitution of 1901 be given a fair trial before it be annihilated." So who was in this minority report? Who signed it? E.J. Waggoner, Dr. David Paulson, and Percy T. McGann. These were not lightweights in Adventism at that time. After the report was submitted, Waggoner was granted the floor and he spoke at length. I'd like to share part of what he said with you. He says, "The Bible organization is opposed to the exaltation of any person over others. The Bible organization recognizes leaders, most certainly does. Whomsoever God appoints as leaders ought to be recognized, and will be recognized by the body, if they are leaders indeed. For authority rests in the individual and his relation to God, and not in the position to which he is elected. And truth is truth, though it be spoken by one who has no standing or official position." And then Waggoner said, "An error cannot be made to be truth, or mistakes cannot be made to be right, because promulgated by someone in official position, or even by the whole body. And we should recognize, and we must educate ourselves and the people to recognize the truth of the Bible, and to be recognized by the Bible and the Spirit of God, so that whenever any cause comes up for decision, we have that one thing to guide us. Now, this meeting was begun at 11 o'clock. It doesn't tell us what time they adjourned, but they adjourned this meeting sometime probably around 12 o'clock or 12:30, because they said that they would reconvene at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So if you were to take the bulletin and read through everything from the beginning of the session until this time, I'm sure it would take at least an hour, and by the time you have floor processes going on, in other words, they were taking a break until 2 o'clock. Shortly after reconvening, Brother Schultz made a motion to limit discussion to 5 minutes per person. They're trying to shut this down. You can speak, but only 5 minutes. But A.T. Jones spoke against that. Even A.G. Daniels spoke against it. And question was called, and the motion was lost. The chair at that time was H.W. Cottrell, and he then gave Percy T. McGann the floor. And McGann began, and I'll share with you some of McGann's statement. It's long, and we're only going to be looking at parts of it here. I would recommend you read the whole bulletin on this area. But you have the references here. General Conference Bulletin, again, April 10, 1903, now page 150.7. McGann said, "I fully appreciate the gravity of this situation, and I have absolutely no intention of in any way filibustering or trying to use a little time in which to say nothing." Now, those of us in America, if you've watched the news for a while, you've been hearing about the term filibuster in the Senate. And filibuster is sort of a tactic that's used sometimes to delay or to allow for long speeches and so on. And he says, I'm not here to do that. Schultz had tried to limit discussion to 5 minutes, and McGann said, I'm not going to talk forever. Now, he didn't talk for just a couple minutes, but he didn't certainly talk forever. But he says, that's not what I'm trying to do. He goes on. As a member of the minority of the Committee on Plans, and as a man, if I had not been on the Committee on Plans at all, I am conscientiously opposed to the proposed new Constitution. I have always felt that the hardest place that any man could be put in this life is to have to stand conscientiously opposed to what the majority of his brethren believe to be right. So the hardest thing to do is stand up to your church against something that they want, that you believe is wrong and you believe you're right on. He continues, to me, it has always appeared to be a much easier thing to stand in a position of opposition to the world, and even to have to face a court of justice in the world for your faith, than to have to face your brethren for your faith. And therefore, I shall say today, as briefly and modestly as I know how, what I have to say. And he doesn't mince any words now. The Minority Report expresses in a word the feelings which actuated the minority in making the report, because we believe that the Constitution proposed by the majority of the committee appears to us to be so subversive of the principles of organization given to us at the General Conferences of 1897 and 1901, almost word for word what Waggoner had stated earlier in the day. Those principles were given to us by the Spirit of God. In my judgment, and in the judgment of the minority of the committee, this Constitution is absolutely subversive of those principles. He continues, further, the proposed new Constitution reverses the reformatory steps that were taken and the principles which were given and which were adopted as the principles of reorganization at the conferences of 1897 and 1901, which were incorporated in the Constitution of 1901. Now, I am not here for a moment to state that the Constitution of 1901 is a perfect one. To my mind, in many respects, it is very imperfect. To my mind, in many respects, it is very clumsily drawn. But I've learned this, that all reforms come gradually, and that in Constitution, clumsy though you may call it, defective though you may mark it, there are principles of reformation and reorganization for the head of this work which are right. Specifically talking about the head of the work, and that this reformation reorganizational principles were right. And those principles are absolutely subverted and swept away by the proposed new Constitution. And then he says this, it may be stated that there is nothing in this new Constitution which is not abundantly safeguarded by the provisions of it. But I want to say to you that any man who has ever read Neander's History of the Christian Church, Mosheim's, or any of the other great church historians, any man who has ever read those histories can come to no other conclusion. What conclusion? No other conclusion but that the principles which are to be brought in through this proposed Constitution, and in the way in which they are brought in, are the same principles and introduced in precisely the same way as they were hundreds of years ago when the papacy was made. McGann says if you've read the church histories, if you've read Neander, Mosheim's, other church histories, you'll see that what we're doing here is exactly what the papacy did and how the papacy was formed in this exact way. And then he goes on, he says further, this whole house must recognize this. Before we are through with this discussion, that the proposed new Constitution, whatever improvements may be claimed for it, whatever advantages it may be stated that it contains, that in principle, as far as the head of the work is concerned, it goes back precisely where we were before the reformatory steps of 2 years ago. But I say that as far as the head of the thing is concerned, as far as the general administration of things is concerned, though not cloaked in the same words, though not hedged about with the same identical language, they are precisely the same principles which governed us up to 2 years ago, and that the moment you vote this Constitution, which I do not believe you are ready to do, yet when you understand this, the moment you vote it, you vote yourself right back where you were 2 years ago and before. Percy T. McGann, General Conference Bulletin of April 10, 1903, pages 147 through 150 in portions. Now, McGann wasn't the only one who spoke, or the last one who spoke. A.T. Jones spoke. Remember A.T. Jones? Jones said, it might be well to call attention to the principles of organization that were given to us in 1897 and 1901. Let me just pause. So, E.J. Waggoner, Percy T. McGann, and now A.T. Jones, they're still focusing on principles that were given to us in the years 1897 and 1901, taking away a central leadership of the church. One word that came to us in 1897, which the General Conference accepted, and upon which it acted in that conference, and which has become a constitutional principle, was spoken in these words. Now notice, there are quote marks here. Do you see the quote marks? If you see the slide, quote marks. It is not wise to choose one man as president of General Conference. The new Constitution does propose that very thing. Where did he get that statement? He got it from Ellen White, and we'll see a couple of these here in just a little bit. But he's quoting from the Spirit of Prophecy. He continues, now that came to us in 1897, and it was accepted by the conference. The committee, of which I happened to be a member with others, acted upon it. And you know that we brought in a report of that committee, and the conference adopted it, of having 3 presidents instead of 1. You know the reasons that were given in conference for it. And again, we mentioned earlier that those 3 presidents worked from America, Australia, and Europe. He continues, this providing one man as president of the General Conference, when the General Conference is bigger now than it was in 1897, is just that much more a reversal of the principle to which God was calling us, and that much more of an emphasis of the principles from which He was calling us as could be. So much for 1897. And again, that's from the General Conference Bulletin of 1903, April 10. Now, he quotes Ellen White, and so let's go back and see what Ellen White had said. This is from Series A, number 8, page 28, paragraph 4, and this is written in 1897. She says, as a people, we should study God's plan for conducting His work. Wherever He has given directions in regard to any point, we should carefully consider how to regard His expressed will. This work should have special attention. And then she says, it is not wise to choose one man as president of the General Conference. That's what she said in 1897. And there were reformatory measures in 1897. In 1901, we have more reform. We're doing this in a stair-step way. We're taking it from one man, putting in the 3, and now the idea is to eliminate the 3. And so in 1901, she's speaking at the Battle Creek College Library before the start of the 1901 session. There's a large group of people there. And here's part of what she said. God wants that these committees that have been handling things for so long should be relieved of their command and have a chance for their life and see if they cannot get out of this rut that they are in, which I have no hope of their getting out of, because the Spirit of God has been working and working, and yet the King is still there. The King is still there. Now the Lord wants His Spirit to come in. He wants the Holy Ghost King. She was speaking about the presidency. And so they listened to her and they eliminated it. And then again in 1903, she again voiced God's thoughts. It is not wise to choose one man as president of the General Conference. Never should one mind, or two minds, or three minds, or four minds, or a few minds, I should say, be considered of sufficient wisdom and power to control and mark out plans, and let it rest upon the minds of only one or two or three in regard to this particular part of the field that we have. And again, notice that she's put this in quotation marks. Some of her own statements, she's quoting some of her own statements from 1897. Now, A.T. Jones, again, followed McGann, and he also said this in 1903. In 1901, this principle was given to us, and these are the principles on which we acted in 1901, which were accepted by the conference, which were before the committee when this Constitution was adopted, which we have, which was their guide in the formation of the Constitution, which the conference embodied in the Constitution and accepted by adopting that Constitution. He continues, one of the principles announced there is this: never should one mind, or two minds, or three minds, or four minds, or a few minds, I should say, be considered of sufficient wisdom and power to control and mark out plans, and let it rest upon the minds of only one or two or three in regard to this particular part of the field that we have, end quote. Where's he quoting from? He's quoting from Ellen White. He's quoting from Ellen White. He goes on. And the present Constitution, as it provides that any 5 members can be a quorum when the President is present, and those 5 acting as a quorum of the committee will take steps that will involve the whole 25. How could there be anything more subversive of the principles that were given to us, of the very first one given to us, which was embodied in that Constitution, which was a guide in making the Constitution in which that Constitution stands for? And so Jones, he sees what it says. It says that 5 people with the President can basically do what the 25 are supposed to do. And remember, the 25 are supposed to be basically representing the work of the world church. And that's a lot to put on even just 25 people. Now, we said that in 1901, a thorough work had not been done. And yet, because progress was made, the angels of God were in those aisles. Even the great God of heaven himself had come down, and they walked up and down in the midst of those aisles, and that heaven rejoiced because of what was done. They just wanted more done. But now how did heaven react to what happened with the new Constitution, which, by the way, was voted in with, I think, about an 85 or 90% of the vote of the conference? How did heaven react to that? In 1901, the General Conference was at Battle Creek. And it had been at Battle Creek for a long time. But in 1903, they moved the General Conference to Oakland, California. Partly, perhaps, because Ellen White was living at Elmshaven, had just come back recently, 2 years before this. She was living at Elmshaven at St. Helena, not far from Oakland. And Ellen White went back to Elmshaven, and in April 21 of that year, she wrote the following from Elmshaven. And remember, April 21, we're talking about 11 days after this discussion. Okay, just 11 days. And she wrote this. She wrote a testimony called, Shall We Be Found Wanting? Shall We Be Found Wanting? And it begins by stating, and you can find this in Volume A of the Testimonies on page 247.2. Volume A, 247.2. In the balances of the sanctuary, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is to be weighed. Not might be weighed, is to be weighed. She will be judged. Not might be judged, she will be judged. How? By the privileges and advantages that she has had. If her spiritual experience does not correspond to the advantages that Christ, at infinite cost, has bestowed on her, if the blessings conferred have not qualified her to do the work entrusted to her, On her will be pronounced the sentence found wanting. By the light bestowed, the opportunities given, will she be judged. And truthfully, friends, could this be said differently of any other group, any other people, of us? By the light that's been given us, by the opportunities bestowed upon us, will we also ourselves not be judged? She went on to say later in the testimony on page 250.2, who can truthfully say, our gold is tried in the fire, our garments are unspotted by the world? I saw our instructor. Do you notice it has a capital I? Capital I? I saw our instructor pointing to the garments of so-called righteousness. Stripping them off, he laid bare the defilement beneath. Then he said to me, can you not see how they have pretentiously covered up their defilement and rottenness of character? How is the faithful city become a harlot? My Father's house is made a house of merchandise, a place whence the divine presence and glory have departed. For this cause there's weakness, and strength is lacking. That testimony, if you've read it before, and you've noticed the sharpness of it, you've noticed the pointedness of it, you've noticed the call for true Christianity in it, it's all made in relationship to what had happened at the General Conference in Oakland in 1903. And bringing in this new Constitution, putting a president back at the head of the work instead of a committee of men. Now, as I mentioned, we have called for a meeting. And when I say we, a collective group of people who have been meeting from many other home church groups, have called a meeting for March the 11th through the 14th here at Smyrna in West Virginia. This is almost 2 years from the original date of March 20 through 25 that we had originally scheduled to have a conference, but was canceled due to COVID. What will happen? Will a pope or a man be made the head of the church? Will God be dishonored, or will he be honored? I think, friends, if we will listen to the history and take lessons from the history, this need not happen again. I believe that we can do better, and I believe that by God's grace, we will do better. Remember in 1901, at one point Ellen White said that the angels of God were going up and down the aisles and they were rejoicing. And they were keeping back the forces of evil. And I want you to be praying, and I'm going to be praying, that come this March, we can have this same kind of experience. Because the Bible says that God is no respecter of persons. What he did for those people in 1901, he'll do for us, and he'll help us to do even more. He'll help us to do a thorough work so that in a year, 6 months, 2 years down the road, if we are all still here at that time, that we don't take backsliding steps, but rather that we continue forward in a good way. Now, this conference is actually going to begin on Friday evening, the 11th. We're going to try to have a communion service and that night, and then we'll have a Sabbath of fellowship together, and then on Sunday and Monday we'll have the actual work, the formation of the church. We are inviting, and I should say reformation, the reorganizing of the church. We're inviting interested parties and church groups to attend or to send representatives to the meetings to examine the charter and bylaws. If further refinements are needed, then that will be done by those attending. After any needed final refinements of the documents are accomplished, they will become the basis then of the new reorganization. But I want to make something very clear. This invitation is only for those who are in agreement with the fundamental principles of our pioneers, which were in agreement with the fundamental principles of the Bible. This conference will not be a type of ecumenical gathering for people of varied beliefs. While we realize that there are differences on certain fine points of doctrine, we are calling for a gathering of those who hold to the biblical teachings as expressed from the Bible and enumerated in the 1889 fundamental principles. These were the principles used during the time of Ellen White. Let us also be clear. This is not a conference designed to form a ministry, a unified ministry of all the different churches and ministries. We had the Smyrna ministries and there's other ministries. That's not the point. This is to reorganize the work of the church. We're not trying to say that any one particular ministry cannot continue or should not continue. I am of the firm belief that probably most of them should continue and even be stronger. But in working in a unified way together, we can be supportive of one another in ways that we just couldn't prior. And so again, this is to orderly reorganize the church in the United States. I want you to please consider seriously this endeavor that is before us. The work of heaven, friends, is done in order, and we need to work in order also. And remember, as we noted earlier from the dictionary, organization is simply the orderly way that a goal is achieved by. It's just working in an orderly way to achieve a goal. We want to work in an orderly way to achieve a goal. We just come together in an organized way to do that, and you can call it organization, you can call it whatever you want. But it gives us the chance to do things collectively that would be almost impossible for any of us to do independently. God doesn't want us to be independent atoms anymore. God doesn't want us to work without acknowledging other workers. We can help each other if we will. We don't have to be selfish in the work. We can go out and we can share in the work. And for instance, here at Smyrna, we have printing facilities. We're the only major group, at least in America that I know of, that has any kind of printing facility. And maybe major is not a good word, minor. We're a small little group here. A motley crew at best, if you please. But we have a printing facility. Maybe we can do more printing for other people. Where they don't have the ability to print, we can print for them. Maybe someone else has been working on establishing a medical missionary institute or a sanitarium, and I've got someone who needs 3 weeks in a sanitarium for rehabilitation, and I don't have a facility. I can send them to those people. But we're all here working as independent atoms. We're afraid to let our works cross because, someone who's been supporting me might just start supporting someone else, and I might lose their support. Friends, we have to throw all those kind of thoughts into the depths of the ocean. Because if God is in the work, God will support the work, God will take care of the work. And the moment that God's not taking care of the work, it's not the right work and we need to get out of it anyhow. So I just pray that you will take these thoughts seriously, that these lessons, especially from 1901, 1903, 1897, that they will be incorporated in the charter and bylaws that you'll be reading about in the February issue of OPAS. You will see that there is no provision for a president, a vice president. There is provision for a quorum of a majority plus one. There is need for supermajorities for certain important issues. 1 or 2 people are not going to be allowed to operate and manage things. We can't do that, friends. No one mind or 2 or even 3 or 4 minds are sufficient to know how to run all the work we're told. And we have to come to the place that we believe these testimonies and will follow them. And I want to be the very first one in line to help do that. I have a zeal for the Lord of hosts, and I want to be the first one. Now, if someone else is ahead of me, that's okay. I'll take the last place. I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of the Lord, but I want to be a part of this, and I want you to be a part of it too. And so plan on joining us March 11 through 14 here at Smyrna. We want you to come. We want you to be a part of this, and may God bless you lots and lots and lots.